shouldn't be thinking about refugees as refugees, but refugees as drivers of solutions, as those that are in charge of their own fate.
When people hear displacement, refugees, we need to support women-led organizations.
It gives me hope that there's always a beginning to something and action is needed.
Welcome to State of Africa. I'm Jeff Motta with the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute. Now today, we wrap up our coverage of the Africa Forum on Displacement 2025, hosted by the Amahoro Coalition in Homoko and UNHCR. We begin with an inspiring fireside chat featuring Musi Hassan, the Managing Director for Levers for Change, and Andira Kara, the Program Manager at the IKEA Foundation. Both former refugees now leading global efforts for change.
Andira, very quickly, can you just maybe speak to your journey? Why are you here? How have you found yourself, at IKEA today? Just kind of talk us through that very briefly, if you're able.
I'm originally from Sudan, a place called Nuba Mountains, and I've lived in Kenya since I was very little, maybe since 9 years old, and now I live in the Netherlands. Is it a blessing? Is it a fate? Is it real? But that's who I am. Mohsin, tell me, who are you?
That's a good question. As you've heard, my name is Mohsin Hassan. I am today based in Chicago in the United States. That's where I call home. But I'm first and foremost a child of the continent, and particularly Kenya. This is where I was born and raised. To a father of Yemeni origin, with some Ethiopian and Somali also in me, right? So just in many ways, a child of East Africa. And it's great to be back. Actually, the last time I was back home in Nairobi was 9 years ago. So I'm so excited to be back. But that is me in short, somebody who has always been passionate about displacement and continue to contribute in however small ways I can, in positions where I can sit and kind of influence conversations. So could you maybe just reflect very briefly, what themes, stories really resonated with you today, throughout the conversations that we've heard?
Very briefly again, I think what stood up for me is the stories were told by real people who experience these stories. It's not often what we see. There was a lot of words that were shared as well. A lot of them were Ubuntu. I heard about Umoja. I heard about Mahaba. I heard about inclusion. But another word that was very common was trust. And it came up in wonderful thing. And it says when it lacks, something needs to be done. And when it's not there, we need to question it. But again, there was also another word, inspire. A lot of people said we were inspired. For me, I was going home. It was a reminder. For me, it was about commitment. That is what I take. That has been my reflection. Mohsin, tell me about it.
Thanks for sharing that. I think similar to you, I think I heard a lot of themes. One thing that emerged to me very saliently was this concept of, it's very obvious actually, and it's a sad state of the kind of reflection of the state that we're in today, that we have to say this, which is we need to invest directly in refugee-led organizations, right? That's a theme that's come up throughout the conversations. And I say because, again, I was involved in a challenge that we were running, focused on durable solutions for those who've experienced forced displacement. And in one of the virtual visits that we had, where one of the 5 teams, they were all competing for a $12 million grant. And they had an opportunity to actually speak to the donors who are backing this. And these are folks from the private sector. And I'll come back to this around kind of what we do at Lever for Change and how this ties into this. And he made he put it much more eloquently than I will attempt right now. I'm quite jet lagged, to be honest. But he said, when we actually speak, for example, today about we need to support women-led organizations, right? Or the gender lens, right? It is absurd if somebody claims that I'm all about supporting women initiatives. And then if you look at the organizations that are funded, those organizations are all led by men, for example, right? That's something that we will not accept today, even in this sector. But then when it comes to refugee work, we don't really see that reflected, right? Everybody talks about localization. Those of us who have been in this sector have heard this for decades. So we all recognize that it's something that needs to be done. But when you look at the majority of funding, when it comes to humanitarian work, very, very little, something around 0.01% actually goes directly to refugee-led organizations, right? So that's something that we really need to address. And the other thing that came up for me is this notion of resilience, right? That just by virtue of going through these very traumatic experiences, right? A lot of those of us who have actually gone through forced displacement, somebody earlier said it can either make you or break you, right? And this is something that you see even in the workforce, the resilience that characterizes a lot of individuals who have actually gone through displacement, right? And these are qualities that in the workforce are actually very essential, right? In terms of making a worker driven, right? I think Barakat mentioned that, for example, the drive that a lot of us have or bring to their work. So these are some of the key themes that I saw or I heard that really resonated with me.
Thank you so much, Maxine. There was one thing that I wanted to ask you as well. Yeah. I think we've talked a lot here, and I think when we were getting introduced, there was something to do with the big pockets, and we can be able to get the work done as well. I want you to talk about what's the effective way. Where do we start, and where can people collaborate as well in these spaces?
No, that's a great question. When I met Isaac a few years ago, and he told me about Amahora and what you all are trying to do, it really resonated with me, because one of the things that you see in this space is when people hear displacement, refugees, solutions around these issues, people always think this is the remit of government. This is the remit of the UN and the various agencies within the UN, or nonprofit sector, or philanthropy. And the reality is that it's not. The private sector has a role to play also in the solutions that we want to allow, especially if we're talking about bold solutions. And that's where, for example, our work at Lever for Change actually comes into play, where we recognize that it is hard to give. Quite frankly, if you are a donor with deep pockets, right? We work at institutions and maybe are in circles where we interact with people with deep pockets, not our own deep pockets, unfortunately. But it is difficult sometimes to know where to start, right? There's so many organizations doing fantastic work. We want to give, and we want to give responsibly, right? I think even some of the earlier speakers mentioned this point, right? The gentleman there mentioned, for example, giving loans to refugees, because they will be accountable, they will pay back, right? So how do you navigate that system? And then on the other hand, if you are an organization, if you're a change maker, a problem solver, how do you access opportunities? How do you access funding that truly push you to be bold, right? If I'm talking about, for example, improving education outcomes in Kakuma, and I come in as a funder and I say, here's $10,000, what can you do as a change maker? Whatever you design as a change maker will be commensurate to $10,000, which is nothing, right? So what we're trying to do is incentivize, on one hand, donors to give larger and much more at significantly higher levels, because truly we need a lot more philanthropic capital to go into this sector, more capital from the private sector to go into this space. But then what we've seen is that also incentivizes change makers to be bold in their approach, to think bigger, to think outside the box, right? So we give grants that typically are minimum of $10 million. We have open calls that really make it easier, because you don't need to know who I am, for example, or a program officer or anything like that, right? You don't need to be able to attend conferences where you can rub shoulders with funders. It's transparent, it's open, we're inviting people to participate, and then it's really the merit of your idea, as evaluated by your peers, first and foremost, and then others from the sector, a diverse range of expertise, right? So really democratizing expertise. And this is a great way to actually foster collaboration. So if you are a private sector player or an interested donor, and you don't have the infrastructure, for example, you can still actually do something, right? There's others like you, and you don't need to be able to set up a whole foundation to do something about refugees or any issue that you're passionate about. So just want to put that out there. Again, if you're not familiar with who we are, leverforchange.org. If you're a change maker, plenty of opportunities. Please check us out. Please apply. We're actually going in June, for example. I'm just going to make a quick pitch here. We'll be launching a $25 million open call focused on supporting youth-led organizations tackling climate change, right? So if you're a youth-led organization working anywhere in the world, you'd be able to apply, right? And you'll get at least $1 million in general operating grant, right? So this also goes back to that notion around reporting and making it difficult for people, right? So let's give money to people who have actually shown the track record, trust that they'll deliver, but we also hold them accountable. But it's a process of working together rather than coming in and saying, we want 50 different types of reports and we're only giving you $10,000. So that's kind of what I will share very quickly. But then turning it back to you, Andira, we both sit within philanthropy. One of the notions that we've heard today is this question of localization. In your experience, what does that look like, right? What does true localization and centering local voices actually look like?
It looks like me. It looks like inclusion. It looks like investment and support. And it also believing and trusting in the designing of solutions by the people that are affected. That is what it looks to me. That's what localization means. It doesn't mean bringing whole different ideas, but investing in the ideas that have been working in the communities all this time. That's exactly what it means.
From lived experience to lasting impact. Next up, my colleague, Georgie Nirango, sits down with the UNHCR Deputy High Commissioner Kelly Clements to explore the power of co-creation and partnership in global displacement response.
The Africa Forum on Displacement this time is doing it a bit differently, where you go on ground, the private sector sees what's happening on ground, then when they sit in a room, they say, okay, now the correlation is clear. But what do you make of that distinction this time?
It was incredibly powerful because, of course, this is the third forum, and you have some of those partners that have been with us since the first forum in Kigali. And then you have others that are just joining because they've heard about it, there's a buzz, they understand they need to be engaged, and that sort of thing. And we've had some powerful stories this morning from refugees, from displaced people, telling about their own journey and what they've done. But that's still, it's in a ballroom, it's in a conference space, as opposed to seeing where refugees live, seeing what they are doing to support themselves, to try to make a path for the future, to invest in their children. And so yesterday in Kakuma, and we had incredible support from the youth leaders that put together a program so that and I explained this a little bit earlier, we saw a dynamic where you had business leaders, organizations like ourselves, NGOs, others sitting around talking about solutions, financial inclusion. How could we actually design those solutions? And then the dynamic changed, and it was very intentionally done, where you had the table expand, and you had refugee young people and leaders come to the table, and they started to talk about what it is they're doing and what it is they see for the future and the problem as they see it and the solution that they need to fix it. And it was just classic.
Yeah.
So this is a nice lead-in then to today, where we talk about commitments already made and commitments to come, and where we need to go given the state of the world as it is with regard to so many millions of people that have to leave because of war, conflict, persecution, and why we shouldn't be thinking about refugees as refugees, but refugees as innovators, as drivers of solutions, as those that are in charge of their own fate.
Right.
They want to map that path to the future, and we can help.
All right. It was nice seeing the tables look across each other thinking, are we doing the right financial solution? Yes, it is. So that was interesting.
Right.
You mentioned something about trust growing now within the ecosystem, and which points to today. So the big announcement has been made between UNHCR and the MasterCard Foundation. But before that, there was a conversation you had with Foundation leadership and Rita
Yes.
to also understand where to place trust and ultimately the investment. Speak to us a bit more.
So we've had a partnership now with MasterCard Foundation for about 5 years, and they're an important partner in the forum in the last 3 gatherings we've had. And we've done some important work together on education for youth and some of the pathways to livelihood, so people can actually, earn their own livings, that sort of thing. And especially trying to identify those refugee-led organizations that really are the frontline responders, community advocates, those that are shaping the societies that we want to be able to support. And we've done some work together in places like Sudan, and where we, in a very short period of time, were able to ramp up education for tens of thousands of young people. And I think so over time, we have shown ourselves and our partners, importantly our partners, as an organization that with a little bit of an investment, perhaps we can scale together. And the kind of entrepreneurship that we see in the refugee community, we can't leave displacement and refugees behind as we're trying to invest, particularly here on the continent. And so, my personal connection with the CEO didn't start 5 years ago. It was actually, a year and a half ago, and it was almost a little bit like an interview. Tell me about UNHCR. Where are we? How do we work? How are we governed? Who are your partners? How do you operate? That sort of thing. And who are you? The person. Yes. And we got to know each other, and it was an instant connection. Have incredible admiration for her leadership as president and CEO of the foundation, and also how she sees the world and the role of the foundation and the role of lifting people to be able to aspire to their own futures. And I have a much better appreciation in terms of trust of a foundation like that, with the capacity that it has in terms of the partnership it wants to see with an organization like mine. And I think it's been a wonderful match. And of course, we have a big delivery now on our hands with a whole lot of partners that will be next to us, but the future is bright.
Speaking of which, so that's really nice to know where that contextually, even when you were seated, what was going through both of your minds. But now, by the time this interview comes out, everyone will know the amount, everyone will know what's happening in the partnership. But there was something very powerful that was mentioned on stage, and you alluded to it as well, where the money is one thing, but after this, the work has to be done on ground. Yes. And it's not only UNHCR. Right. There's a lot of partners involved. So how are you going to synergize and at least work with the same goalposts in mind?
So we've made a commitment, particularly over the recent years, that we want to work increasingly with local partners, community-based partners, refugee-led organizations, women-led organizations. And we have built, not just in word, but also in finances, a number of partners with which we have an arrangement, a formal financial agreement in terms of some of the programs they want to deliver on behalf of their people. And they design the project, they design what it is that they want to do, and then we find ways to be able to then invest. And they report back, and in some cases it grows, and that partnership grows. And it's something, we talk a lot about localization, we talk a lot about meaningful participation. For UNHCR, we can't do what we do without refugees at the center. And not just their voices, but also actions and ideas and innovations and solutions. Right. And so what we will do with this gift is actually invest further in at least 100 refugee-led organizations. That will build, I think, the connectivity and the network of those. Some are involved in the commercial space, some are in the education space, others are working on trying to protect people differently and better. Others are working on climate or energy solutions, this sort of thing. And all of that, I think we've done a lot of very interesting work recently to try to build the partnerships that will help us be able to implement this new agreement, but also it will also help to expand the capacity of those that will implement far after we leave.
All right.
They lead.
Okay. I have 2 last questions. So I know a lot of questions you'll hear during this week is what keeps you up at night, what are the pain points that you've gone through so far. But one of the things I would ask is, yesterday one of the players in the financial sector posed a question to the private sector and said, I wish we would see more financial players or saving schemes within Kakuma, for example.
Right.
So what are some of those very direct challenges that you feel like could have been solved a lot quicker that are now going to be possible to handle?
Well, here we are in Kenya,
Yeah.
and we have a government that took a courageous step, actually just a few days ago, to launch the Sharika Plan. And before that came a Refugee Act that made it possible for refugees to own business, refugees to move, refugees to be part of Kenyan society, to be able to help Kenyans drive an economy. And I think, in terms of the challenges we have, when we have policies that are progressive like that, we need to be in there very quickly to be able to support. And it's the private sector that comes with the kind of infrastructure and the things that, frankly, we as a humanitarian organization would not have the wherewithal or knowledge to be able to do. So I think our challenge is then to connect the dots. To identify, obviously we've got problems or issues that we want to solve. We've got private sector know-how to be able to do it. We have refugees then driving program implementation and helping to design and that sort of thing. And it's the whole of society approach that we're going to need to try to find solutions to displacement.
Final question, of course, young people have to be at the core of this. Yesterday we saw the youth that were represented in the room ask, can we ask a few questions to the people in the room? And sadly we were not able to capture some of those, but they did give us the sentiments. So what's the role of young people in program design? I know the comms team is going to be very key with amplification then to a particular demographic, but what's the role of young people in this whole process?
Absolutely essential. I don't know whether or not you followed, Georgie, the Pact for the Future last year, the Summit of the Future. Happened in New York at the General Assembly, and there was a young South Sudanese refugee from Kenya who represented the refugee displacement voice. She was one of only, I think, 5 youth leaders that spoke in front of all of these world leaders. You could have heard a pin drop with her words. Words about investment in the future of refugee youth, about education being something that no one can ever take away, the hopes that refugees have for the future and how world leaders can help to support that. Frankly, we can't do it without the young voices and without the drive and the hope and the aspirations. And we heard it again this morning.
Yeah. Alrighty. Please, do you mind, I know this is a camera, do you mind just looking into the camera and then saying, what does all in mean to you?
All in for us means a complete commitment to inclusion.
On a continent with the largest youth population in the world, young people must be at the heart of these solutions. Time for us to take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at how refugee businesses are becoming hubs of innovation and economic activity. See you on the other side of the break. Welcome back to State of Africa. Can refugee communities become engines of innovation and investment? Well, in Homoko, the largest lender to refugee entrepreneurs believes so, as they have witnessed a remarkable 96% loan repayment rate from refugee participants in their credit products. But just how does the In-Homoko business model make this possible? Here's Sarah Lidom, co-founder in Homoko. Sarah, thank you so much for making time to be here.
Pleasure, Jeff.
I mean, a lot going on in plenary, but I want us to talk about In-Homoko, because when you look at the space that we're in and the work that we're doing, lots of movement and disruption, new contexts coming out every single time. How is In-Homoko adapting itself and its programs to these new realities and new contexts that we're in now?
And In-Homoko is really driven by a core vision to make sure that we have financial inclusion for refugee entrepreneurs and displaced persons. So even though the context is changing, our focus and our values remain consistent. Because we have so many staff from the communities that we serve, we really are able to look at what is happening in each different community that we're in. We're in 34 offices in 5 countries. But it's our team that's on the ground that understands the realities and what's needed within their specific communities. And that's really helping us iterate to make sure that we're responsive in any of the different communities that we're in.
Right. And you talk about that. I mean, finance will be a key issue of discussion, has been is and will be.
And should be.
And should be.
Yeah.
It's very important when we look at that. What are the key lessons coming out, not only in this forum, but in the work that you're doing in terms of financing refugee communities and businesses now?
Yeah. And Homoko is the largest lender to refugees in Africa. We started lending to displaced entrepreneurs in 2016, and we did so really on the values that we have of taking a chance and inclusion of refugee entrepreneurs. And we found over the years that refugee borrowers repay their loans at the same rates as anybody else. We lend up to about $50,000, so it's not small loans. They're actually significant enough to be able to move the needle for growth of businesses. What we hope that this demonstrates to other larger financial institutions and private sector partners is that the entrepreneurs that are working in refugee communities, they're running thriving businesses. They know exquisitely what their communities need, what their customers want, and that those are amazing trademarks for running a thriving business. And so we want investors to also see entrepreneurs in displaced communities as just as investable as any other.
Right, and that actually leads me to, a perfect segue there, because when you talk about risk, I've been in different forums and that has really been a center point of discussion.
Yep.
You look at this particular group, this community, and risk just stands out.
Yeah.
You've gone into that particular space and realized they're not as risky as we thought.
Exactly.
How do you spread that message? How do you actually play your part in shifting that mindset and narrative to other investors and players to rethink how they look at risk here?
Yeah. There's a lot of work that's done generally within the entrepreneurship space across the continent around making sure that entrepreneurs are ready for investment. And I think if we can shift that narrative to say, how do investors get really targeted products and services to meet the needs of their customers. And so what we've been able to do is demonstrate the investability of the entrepreneurs that we serve, do market linkages and matchmaking between investors and the clients that we have, but then also really have empirical data that can be shared both in policy discussions as well as engaging in the private sector. So it's forums like this where we also are having a chance to bring together people who may be interested or see displaced communities as a new market segment that they haven't reached before, and to really start to help people understand what it takes to successfully invest in displaced communities and displaced entrepreneurs.
Right. And because these particular communities don't exist in a vacuum, refugee communities, they're host communities as well, how does Homoko look at how they can foster stronger collaboration and relationships between host communities and the refugee entrepreneurs and communities in those spaces as well?
Yeah, there are already natural linkages that we see between refugee entrepreneurs and host community entrepreneurs. So nobody lives in a vacuum. And so the entrepreneurs that we're working with within refugee communities, they're also using partners within the host community for accessing larger trade routes, for accessing the next larger market down the road or a couple towns over. So we see those natural linkages coming up already. We also see refugee entrepreneurs hiring from within the host community, which I think is beautiful because that really demonstrates how the value of investing in a community actually benefits the entire community. Economic benefit doesn't stay in one tiny lane. Economic benefit, when you're investing in an area, can impact job creation, money in people's pockets, whether you're identified as a refugee or identified as a host community member.
Right. And for a person who's in the business of actually lending this money, you can see where the highest rate of return is, different sectors, different spaces. What did you call the most promising industries for refugee entrepreneurs to get into, displaced communities to get into? You're giving your money out and you can see the ROI on this. This is a goal they need to be looking at.
Exactly.
What should they be looking at?
The best investments are ones that meet the needs of the community. And so when we're looking at refugee communities, some of the still basic needs that are happening in communities is access to energy, access to transportation and logistics, access to trade, so wholesale markets. So these core services that can both meet the needs of households, but also meet the infrastructure needs of the larger community as the community thrives, those are really great areas for investment.
And I want to stick to that particular area of investment because right here we're talking about an all-in approach, private sectors in the room as well. what are the opportunities they should be looking at when they come in? Because there's a bit of a conversation going there, and for private sector, their mind shifts only when they see their P&L shifting. You know, if they can get more money, they will be there.
Exactly.
What are the most promising areas they should be looking at going in these particular communities?
As private sector is looking to come into refugee communities and work with displaced consumers, there's a lot more opportunities that have just basically never been touched. So we look at telecoms, even things like M-Pesa. There's some complications and some regulations where there could be opportunities for mobile money or other private sector partners to be able to invest more in financial services. There are household goods and services items. As people have more and more stable income, they're adding in more and more items in their households. Again, transportation, education, there's a lot of different opportunities that are still just very, very ripe for additional private sector investment.
Right. Earlier we'd spoken about, you know, how we can redesign and change the mind shift and narrative around these particular communities. I want to ask you that specific question. If you could redesign, for example, how banks, you know, operate in these particular communities, how they treat this particular entrepreneur and market space, or any corporate, what's that one thing you'd want to redesign? Because you've seen it be a flaw and you're like, guys, we need to rethink this. What's that one thing you would redesign?
When you center the customer at the core of whatever service you're offering, you're able to make sure that the products and services that you're offering really meet the needs of your customer. And it's not rocket science. If banks and other private sector partners are really looking at the day-to-day realities of refugee entrepreneurs, of displaced communities, there are simple things that they can do to redesign their services to meet the needs. So it's everything from looking at, instead of having a line on the form that says enter your national ID with a certain number of numbers, what's that space that's on the form for refugee ID with a different number of numbers? So those are simple kinds of things which are small regulatory shifts that can make a really big difference for inclusion. Just making sure that there's a valid, that a refugee ID card can be also valid as a proper ID card and not needing a passport or a national ID card. Really simple things that just indicate to refugee entrepreneurs and refugee households that the products and services offered are acceptable and available for them as well.
Okay. I think we have two questions before we come to a close on this one. One is to look at, you know, fragility in these particular communities and spaces. How do we ensure and bolster resilience there? Because it's a key concern for every private sector player coming in. How do we bolster, you know, resilience in these fragile communities?
And Homoko launched in South Sudan a handful of years ago. And it was one of the more fragile environments that we had been in. And what we learned by showing up is that when you stand with a community, the community will also stand with you. And so as entrepreneurs are looking to who they can rely on for the volatility of their business, highs and lows of inflation, taxes, just the general operating environment, when we stand with the entrepreneurs that we're serving, there's really a loyalty and a trust that's built up there. And so it's really through these kinds of partnerships that we can create a solid foundation. And when businesses are supporting fragile communities, the community recognizes that. And so it's not that we come in when everything is even and perfect. Coming in with a risk tolerance that says we're going to stand with the community, we're going to stand with these businesses when not everything is perfect, that we see as an early level risk, which, you know, you don't want to be too risky, but an early level risk that allows people to see your business, our business, as one that stands with the community. And we hope that that will pay off dividends for the long run.
Okay. And I think that just lends us perfectly to the last question, because you told us where and when you started. When you look forward to 2030, what's that bold vision for InHomoko? When you get to 2030, what's the milestone that you want to, you know, to get to?
So InHomoko is working with entrepreneurs currently in 5 countries. By 2030, we will have supported businesses and entrepreneurs that will have improved the lives of 7.6 million people across the continent. We see our real focus is in moving people out of poverty, moving people off assistance, and that there's enough revenue coming from their businesses and from jobs within displaced communities that people will be able to live independently with dignity and self-sufficiency. And that's really our bold vision for the future, is that more and more people will be able to have the resources that they need as aid continues to drop, that the private sector will continue to invest, and that refugee communities themselves will be able to be self-sufficient and self-supported.
From a social enterprise with deep experience in refugee settings, we now shift to someone newly engaging with this space. Colin Scotia, founder of Zaria Mobility, shares how this experience opened his eyes to the potential for African businesses to move beyond charity and build meaningful, sustainable partnerships with displaced communities. Colin Scotia, Zaria Mobility, many thanks for making time to be here. And thanks for being part of this conversation. Now, the interesting part of our conversation is the fact that all throughout the day we've been talking about how we can get private sector more involved in this particular space. And when we talk about this amorphous group of private sector, it's individuals like you, who are supposed to be more involved as far as forcibly displaced communities are concerned.
Okay.
This is your first interaction with this particular space and what they're doing and the opportunity in there. What's been your assessment so far from what you saw, the people you've interacted with throughout the day?
Okay. So thanks for having me. I think it's been a great day, very informative. I've gotten the chance to hear a lot of stories from refugees, the people who are also in the space, impacting lives, changing lives of the refugees and the displaced. And so coming here, first of all, I had no idea what it's going to be like. But then just being here today, there's so much opportunity that the private sector can tap into, just to showcase how the displaced and the refugees' talent is. So for me, the takeaways I got from today is there's so much opportunity that personal organization can utilize to bring out what the refugees are doing in the camp and what talent they can also provide out in the world. And so for us, I think it's something that we shall go on the drawing board, sit and see how we can commit to see how we can foster a change and bring about what you've actually taken in today in terms of how we can be of impact to the refugees outside there in Kakuma or in Dadaab or the countries that also we cover who are also displaced people, and how we can give them opportunity to actually flourish in whatever they're doing in the camp.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for you, from the interactions that you saw, because the thing is, when we talk to private sector, they all agree there's so many opportunities in here, not only in terms of marketplace, but also talent to get. Where's the disconnect? Because if it's that replete with opportunity, surely there should be more private sector engagement. Is it knowledge and communication not getting out? Is it risk getting into the space? For you as a private sector player, what's been the hesitation so far up until this particular point?
I think lack of information. Like from today when I came, the notion I had is this is refugees setup discussion. The public perception also there is negative about even the NGO space that are dealing with refugee space basically. And I think where the private sector is also very reluctant is there's not much information for them to hear about what the refugees are doing in the displacement camps that they're in basically. So it's knowledge that we need to be told about, be physically present when such engagements happen, because then you get to hear the stories behind it and not read from either a press, something in the internet, or lack of proper information that is outside there right now in our world, but just to get to understand, okay, these people are actually doing something on the ground and they need support from us as a private sector. So how can you tap into it, invest in them? Because like the numbers I had today is 70 billion USD being generated in a year. I mean, that's a lot of money when compared to what the diaspora is bringing in, for example. So if the private sector can be given knowledge and information about what the refugees are doing actually on the ground, and then also make time to go to Kakuma and Dadaab and see for ourselves what is on the ground. And that's what I purposely I want to initiate with our team, to actually go on the ground and see, because we can hear it, but maybe it's different on the ground. But then when you talk to the refugees also who are here, and you hear their stories, they also need to be in tandem with what UNHCR might be saying, or other key stakeholders in the industry might be saying. And so I think knowledge-based information is critical to the private sector.
Right.
That way they can be able to understand, okay, this is really what is happening in this particular sector. And how can you tap into it? How can we invest into them and make their work come out in the limelight? You know, not just depend on grants, but make them sustainable with whatever they're doing and work in partnership with the private sector.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's unpack that a bit further and speak to what Zara Mobility does, and also how you see, you know, it plugging into this particular forcibly displaced community space as well.
So we are, there are 4 aspects of our services. I will speak to one that is literally hits home when it comes to refugee and displacement, and that is trade and labor mobility side of it. So I think what you can do as an organization is to, using our contacts, using our clientele, is to see how can you market the refugee products in the outside market based on investments, or investors want to come and tap into that space as well. How can we showcase what they're doing to our clientele and see how can we give them a name in the outside world. We are in discussion to see how can we generate investments for women-led organizations or women-led startups in the country right now. And for me, I think having a discussion even with just some refugees who are here today, there's a whole spec of women-led initiatives in Kakuma, right? And as a company, how can you tap into that to give them investors who can literally help them propel whatever they're doing to the outside world, for it to be visibly seen that, wow, this is interesting. How can we help them be sustainable and not just depend on, like I said, grants coming in to help them achieve their goals? How can we foster their products? How can we foster them to go and work in the outside world? Right now, of course, we need to understand that there's so many restrictions that have been placed, and which is understandable. But I think at the end of the day, if we work in tandem, both government and private sector, I believe we can tap into their talent and market them not only in Europe, but also in Africa. There's so much talent for them in Africa to be done, even in our own country. And people don't know about it, right? So if you can tap into that and see how we can work in tandem with both government, private sector, and the players already who are in it, then I believe there's so much opportunity that you can, as an organization, as a private sector, bring out to the limelight.
Right. I want to talk a bit more about that because with Zara Mobility, you have presence both in East and West Africa.
Yes.
And right now, the whole talk is about how we can actually seize the AFCFTA. You know, we have this continental free trade area. We really need to look inwards as a continent. How do you think we can use that to properly harness and even deploy all of these opportunities we have in these forcibly displaced communities to, you know, deploy around the continent? How should they look at this particular opportunity and seize it?
I think first of all, you need to cut the bureaucracy in the system. Movement within Africa is very hard, even as an African, right? For me to go to a different country, the visa checks, plane tickets, I think we need to make movement easy to begin with. The AFTA coming on board with trade will open barriers. I don't know how many countries right now have signed. I'm not quite sure about that. But the last meeting we had at the UN, countries are now coming on board. African countries are realizing, I mean, we need to take the future in our own hands. We need to open trade barriers. Whatever barriers that have been put on trade, we need to open them. Now, until you open those barriers and make African governments come on board and actually sign this agreement, it will be easier to have the displaced and the refugees also, their paperwork made easy in the respective countries that they're stationed in. Because unless also the paperwork is made easy, then they can't move around.
Right.
They can't showcase whatever they want to move. And that's what the mobility aspect side of it is. It's movement, free movement of people with ease. And so if we can get paperwork for the displaced and the refugees easy for them to access when it comes to migration services or paperwork for them to work, Kenyan IDs or whichever IDs are in their countries, then when the agreement comes on board, they can easily move around and showcase their products, right? Because there'll be citizens or there'll be locals integrated in the system. So they'll be part of the community. And they're part of our brothers and sisters. These are not excluded members of the society, right? These are part of us. So if you talk about free movement, trade barriers have to be cut off. Make it easier for the refugees and the displaced after vetting, because security is key. They've been vetted, they're okay to integrate into society, give them the local documentations they require, and then free movement of them will be easy for them in long term even to be sustainable, because sustainability is key. And how can you run away from funds and from grants is showcasing our businesses to each other in Africa, opening the barriers, and that way we'll be sustainable to sell amongst ourselves. And even them, they will be comfortable to say, you know what, we are one. So let's integrate in the community and let's showcase what you have, both talent, both products that they're making by hand or business, and move around Africa with ease.
Okay.
Yeah.
As we come to the close of this particular conversation, for you as an entrepreneur, as a private sector player, what do you see as your short-term or mid-term intervention, as you say, and engagement in getting to this particular space? Already, you've spoken to one entrepreneur and you're making your trip to Kakuma, but now as a full engagement, what do you think that looks like for you from where you stand?
I think partnering with either the institutions that are already in the space, because we're getting into this to learn more about it. From past experience, it's always been a negative aspect side of it. But now putting myself here, learning even from, like I said, one lady called Sudi Noor, who explained what it is like 16 years in Kakuma. And the brand she's right now doing, for example, of sanitary pads, that can last, I think, for a year, because it's washable and durable. So getting into that conversation made me realize there's actually a long-term goal here in terms of investments and tapping into what the refugees' talent and expertise are in as an entrepreneur and can be for the long-term whole of it. Because there's so much that we can tap into long-term to make them sustainable and actually to gain, because I'm an entrepreneur, I'm in business. But they're also in business. And you need to understand that we're all in business. And so once you tap into it now, get to learn what they're doing, get to learn what is on the ground, get to learn the ideas for the future. Then you can plug in and say, for short term, I think for now, how can I assist even someone like Sudi Noor to showcase her products? Now in the long term, how can she be sustainable to venture into the rest of Africa or even the rest of the world? Because it's not only in Africa where we have displaced refugees, it's happening all over, in Palestine, in Ukraine, whatever. So how can they be a story in the long run that their success was not only mid-term, but long-term in whatever produces they did or whatever talent they put out in the world.
That does it for our focus on the Africa Forum on Displacement 2025. We'd like to hear from you too. How can we shape better futures for displaced communities? Connect with us through our Aladi social media pages. Until next time, I'm Jeff Morte. Goodbye.